listening to Weekends on 980 CKNW.
Oh, yes, indeed. And happy long weekend to you, Bruce Claggett in. And hope your long weekend adventures are safe and enjoyable. You know, it happens quite often. In fact, all year round, we hear of these stories of stranded hikers on the North Shore Mountains. And you've got to give kudos to, like, North Shore Rescue for stepping in and helping out some of the hikers, especially when they get stuck in some very tenuous terrain and difficult conditions. We had a couple of these occur last weekend, and one story stands out. And the reason why it stands out is one of two hikers that were stranded around the Lions Bay area actually used a amateur radio, a ham radio, handheld portable radio, like a walkie-talkie that you grow up with, you know, those just little handhelds, but it's a handheld radio to call for help. And those who were able to talk with him until rescuers arrived kept him in pretty positive spirits all the way through. One of the first people that actually talked with him and identified that he needed help was David Barks, an amateur radio operator that talked with another ham radio operator. And we'll bring him in to talk about this story because I think it's a little bit different and it really shows the power of a hobby that can actually help out when cell phones don't work at all. David Barks, good morning. Thank you very much for joining us.
Good morning, Bruce. My pleasure. It was quite an interesting story that happened last weekend.
Yeah, let's run through some of the basics. How did you come across this ham radio operator, fellow ham radio operator, being in trouble? And tell me how the story unfolded.
Sure. Well, I was doing projects in my amateur radio shack. Other people might know that as the man cave. And I had my amateur radio on, listening to one of the local amateur radio frequencies, and I heard a very scratchy, very poor signal, and in the noise I could hear someone talking for any station and that they had a message, and that's what I first heard.
Now, this doesn't happen too terribly often, but I understand that you do have a little bit of a background with rescues. You've got some expertise and have helped out people in the past, right?
Yes. So in another life, when I was much younger, I was with the RCAF, and I was a search and rescue pilot on helicopters. So yes, I'm familiar with rescue and search and rescue.
So those same instincts kick in, and you hear this voice. Tell me what happened then.
Yeah, I was able to respond to the very poor signal, and through the noise and after many, many tries, I got the message that an individual and a fellow ham radio operator was on a hike up on the North Shore Mountains, and he wanted me to get a message to his wife that via phone that he was late or was not going to make his rendezvous time, and so I was able to copy that down.
Now, at that point, it goes from being late to something where you really have to call in, I guess, the police and North Shore Rescue ultimately. Whether the police pass it on, I guess, is their decision. Tell me about that. Yeah, so that was rather interesting. There was another amateur radio operator also listening. That was Victor Alpha 7 Juliet Charlie is his call sign, and his name is Jonathan. So I called his wife and told her that he wouldn't be able to make his call to her. She informed me that when he was going to get to the Cypress Mountain ski area, he was going to call for a ride.
And so I did that, and then Victor Alpha 7 Julia Charlie Jonathan called me, and then we talked on the phone. And he also had heard some of the transmissions and deciphered it. And there was two things that was quite interesting on the call, the radio contact, was that the person was stuck on their hike, and the interesting comment was, I don't think I need search and rescue or North Shore search and rescue yet. And after thinking about that for a few moments, I decided to call the West Vancouver police to advise them that there was a stranded hiker.
And ultimately, this ended up in a search effort by North Shore Rescue and I guess a rescue team out of Lions Bay, because that's where he was, if I understand correctly. It wasn't until the next morning, though, that the hiker, ham radio operator, was escorted out. Am I right?
Yes, that's correct. So the really interesting thing was the amateur radio operator that was stranded on the mountains was able to switch to a different frequency, and there was another amateur radio operator, Bob, Victor Echo 7 Romeo Papa X-ray. He was able to start talking to him, and he had contacted the Squamish RCMP. So there was two things on the go. Bob was later in the evening, but the search master or the search manager from North Shore Rescue had asked me to reestablish contact, and they launched a helicopter, and the stranded hiker was using his amateur radio, and we were doing the thing about, can you hear the helicopter, and he was reporting, yes, it's south of me, and is it getting closer? And so I was relaying that information in real time on the phone to North Shore Search and Rescue, and eventually they were able to get the helicopter right over top of them, and at that time that was a great thing. And then the rescue switched to so once North Shore Rescue had a position, they passed that off to the Lions Bay Search and Rescue people, and they did great. And then there was more work where they were on the frequency, and there was some frequency coordination, and then about midnight or a little bit before midnight, the stranded person could see they're wearing LED headband lights. He was pretty excited that he could see the lights coming towards him.
Now, ultimately, he was okay, not injured, but definitely spent the night up there, and that's got to be disconcerting for him. But it's a good news story. And it's a story where cell phones in that area, you think of mountains being high, but a cell phone doesn't work. There's no cell phone coverage. So that's got to be a big boost for the ham radio community, right?
Yes, I think so. If this person didn't have his amateur radio, I think he would have been in real trouble. His cell phone was not in coverage, and then eventually his cell phone was. And so without his amateur radio, and the other thing too is he wasn't on a trail that he initially had reported to his wife that he was going to take. He ended up on a different trail. And so I think it could have been a long time, a very long time, before he was found or located. He ended up being dehydrated and out of juice, and he was down in deep ravines, and the forest was so thick that he was unable to proceed. And so the amateur radio really made a difference because he had no cell coverage.
Well, it's a wonderful story indeed, and those who are interested in amateur radio as a hobby, if they're in the outdoors, how can they find out information on getting a license, David?
There's lots of stuff online. You can just do a Google search, amateur radio in Canada, and that will bring a whole bunch of information. It's a very diverse and wonderful hobby. There's lots of activities, different areas of the hobby, and amateur radio in Canada would start you out on a path. And there are various clubs that run the courses, and there's a huge community that's very supportive of anybody that's interested in becoming an amateur radio operator or a ham radio operator. Same thing. And so, yeah, it's a fantastic hobby. There's great people, and it's just great.
Well, as they say, 7-3, and thanks so much for spending time. And that's David Barks, amateur radio operator, first making contact with a hiker who ran into difficulty last Sunday, going into Monday, spent the night up on the mountain. Stay with us. Coming up next hour, your holiday travel and BC Ferries promises of a better long weekend ahead this time. But why has ferries